All's Rin Fair and Love and War. It's NES Works episode 139.
Come back here now, here now.
Before we return to medieval times and tuck into that turkey leg, first it's time to see to the divorcee in the family. Yes, in the way of divorced dudes everywhere, Tengen is coping with its breakup with Nintendo by getting really into fast cars. That newly single energy manifests for Tengen in the form of Super Sprint, an NES conversion of a 1986 Atari arcade title. This is not the first post-breakup Tengen release, of course, but unlike Tetris, Super Sprint has never been recalled or subject to legal threats, to my awareness, which means that you can still find it at second-hand vendors pretty easily and it doesn't cost some ridiculous sum. Yahtzee! And much to my surprise, Super Sprint holds up pretty well in NES. It looks deeply unimpressive, but looks definitely deceive in this case. Super Sprint follows on from some of Atari's earliest arcade hits, the Grand Track series of the 1970s. Those eventually evolved into Sprint, which evidently found some sort of power-up mushroom and grew into Super Sprint. Except it didn't really grow, now did it? Grand Track was a solo racing experience, but its successors allowed more and more people to play simultaneously. This culminated in 1975's Indy 800, where the 800 had nothing to do with the number of laps you had to complete, but rather nodded toward the number of people who could participate simultaneously. Indy 800 allowed 8 people to race simultaneously around a single jumbo video monitor, a dazzling 25-inch CRT, baby, and control a tiny little car with their own steering wheel and accelerator pedal. Impractical, yes, but also precisely the kind of goofball gimmick that helped make Atari the gods of the arcade in those early days. In order to support that many people crowding around together over a single screen, Indy 800 depicted its action with a bird's-eye perspective in which no particular side of the track represented up. This meant that no player had a particular advantage over the other, and it also meant that the cars that raced around the screen needed to be tiny little guys, like Matchbox cars seen from the sky. Super Sprint carried that spirit into the 1980s, giving players dinky little cars that they could control around an aerial view of the racetrack. That was a pretty bold creative decision, considering that Sega released the visually spectacular Outrun into arcades around the same time that Super Sprint arrived. It almost sounds ridiculous to begin comparing the two games, given the immense gulf in their technical performance, and that's fine. The two games have nothing in common besides the fact that they involve cars going fast. But there are different ways for cars to go fast, and the duality of Outrun and Super Sprint neatly demonstrate that fact. Outrun put its emphasis on vibes and scenery, challenging racers to hit checkpoints before running out of a countdown, and branching along different public highways through varied terrain and backdrops as diegetic FM synth calypso played on the car stereo. Super Sprint wants none of that. It's all about outracing 3 other cars and being the first to reach the finish line across 3 laps in increasingly convoluted self-contained racetracks. Is there even music? Honestly, as I write this script, I can't remember. I don't think there is. But it doesn't matter. Super Sprint is not about vibes, it is about fast action and precise racing control in narrow lanes where other cars jockey for position and dynamic hazards can send you spinning out of control and spoil the entire race for you in a split-second surprise. Super Sprint's tiny courses don't look as good on NES as in arcades, but the essence of the game comes through. The track layouts neatly recreate the coin-op tracks, all the way down to the crisscrossing paths, hidden underpasses, and the occasional opportunity to navigate precisely through gaps in the scenery in order to take shortcuts that can shave a crucial split-second off your lap time. You need to avoid water puddles that create speed-killing drag, oil slicks that cause you to lose your grip on the road, and rogue tornadoes that send your car spinning at high speeds in a random direction. However, you can also zip over score bonuses that boost your point tally, and more importantly, tune-up icons that allow you to upgrade your car's specs. The cars here look tiny, but they move at breakneck speeds and animate smoothly as they steer through many degrees of rotation. And in the end, only the racer who crosses the finish line gets to move along to the next race. If all of this sounds kind of familiar, that's because Leland Corp straight up ripped off this concept for its Super Off-Road series. Sure, Leland tilted the track graphics into an isometric perspective to give the whole affair the illusion of depth, and it rewarded players with Bikini Girl graphics rather than a simple thumbs up, but Super Off-Road simply lifted Super Sprint's design wholesale to great success. Super Off-Road would make its way to NES in 1990, but as of summer 1989, you could only play it in arcades. Honestly, Tengen timed the release of Super Sprint pretty effectively. A big ol' knockoff was racking up cash in arcades, and here was a very similar, suspiciously similar really, experience available for play at home. And they probably would have gotten away with it too, if not for the fact that Tengen and Nintendo had gone their separate ways, and major retailers didn't want to stock unlicensed Tengen games for fear that Nintendo would stop supplying them with licensed NES releases. That kind of monopolistic approach was in fact illegal, as courts would rule a few years later, but that didn't do much to help Super Sprint's fortunes here in 1989. That's a shame because Super Sprint delivers a pretty entertaining experience nearly a year before Off-Road would arrive. It does suffer somewhat from the limitations of NES control options, namely the lack of an official racing controller and the lack of support for more than 2 players. Super Sprint allowed 3 people to race simultaneously in arcades, like Super Off-Road, and zip around the track with a steering wheel. The multiplayer design and kinetic interface played heavily into the game's appeal. The cars controlled like someone had blown out the steering coupler, so you really had to throw your back into the action in order to move precisely or quickly. The NES's 4-player solutions wouldn't arrive until 1990, coinciding with the launch of Super Off-Road as it happens, and Nintendo would never produce a racing wheel of their own. So Tengen's programmers compensated by tuning the NES port in small but vital ways. There's nothing to be done for the lack of 3-person play, of course, but Super Sprint on NES rebalances the racing controls by making them overly sensitive rather than carrying forward the coin-op's understeer. The overall effect works out to be largely the same, even though you need to control your car with tiny digital nudges rather than dramatic analog elbow grease. The point is that you need to master these control techniques, either way. Super Sprint on NES only features 7 tracks versus the arcade's 8, and they quickly grow in complexity and challenge, with opposing computer-controlled racers growing more aggressive and precise with each new track. And it does support 2-player action, if not 3, so there's still plenty of opportunity to annoy a friend or sibling by smashing them into a spin or interfering with their attempts to steer into the narrow aperture of a track shortcut. Super Sprint offers a totally different take on racing than we've seen on NES to this point, and it steals back a little glory from the arcade competitor that lifted its entire concept. It's just a shame that most kids back in the day never had the chance to give it a try due to the chilly relations between Nintendo and Tengen. But hey, what are video games even about if not corporate politics getting in the way of a good time? We've arrived at August 1989, a month that's a milestone for the NES and video game history in ways we'll explore soon. But first, for the moment, we need to look at a new, slightly different kind of experience for NES, courtesy of Ultra Games, Cinemaware, and Konami. At this point, Ultra Games has neatly settled into its mission, a label for games that Konami wanted to publish in America, but not back home in Japan. I mean, that wouldn't always be the case with Ultra releases, since Gyrus, Metal Gear, and TMNT had all shipped in Japan before showing up here, but by and large, this label is the dumping ground for Konami's overseas off-brand titles. Defender of the Crown really embodies that in a way we haven't seen before. Unlike previous Ultra games that didn't reach Famicom, such as Q*bert or Skate and Die, which saw their greatest success in the US but still had appeal for Japanese fans, it's hard to imagine Defender of the Crown appealing to Famicom fanatics, at least in this incarnation. On a fundamental level, this is just a profoundly simplistic take on the strategy and simulation genre. That fact is really thrown into high relief by the fact that Defender of the Crown arrives here on NES about a month after Koei's console adaptation of Nobunaga's Ambition. Koei's simulations have been an institution in Japan for nearly 4 decades at this point. Serious simulation and strategy fans love their depth, breadth, and complexity. Games heady enough for computers, but intuitive enough to work on consoles. Defender of the Crown does not hit those marks. If you did one of those little JoJo stand attribute charts for this game, its stats would almost entirely skew in one direction. A rankings for arcade action and breezy brevity, and a paltry D for depth, complexity, and options. Like Nobunaga's Ambition, Defender of the Crown breaks up an island into multiple medieval territories under the control of distinct warlords. In this case, Britain consists of 16 territories, and you can play as one of 4 Saxon leaders in an attempt to take control of the entire island and become king by crushing the Norman invaders and their Frenchy ways while allying with or subjugating your fellow Saxon aspirants. To accomplish this, you need to earn cash and raise an army that can simultaneously defend your home turf while taking down rival armies. There's some strategy and money management involved here, of course, but compared to the dozen or so factors you had to manage each turn in Nobunaga's Ambition, it feels like a baby game. You don't need to worry about feeding your army or investing in fields, adjusting taxes on your citizens, or wooing a rival's daughter in order to create an alliance through matrimony. It's really just a matter of earning cash, dividing your earnings strategically among different army units like knights and infantry, and conquering your way across Britain one fiefdom at a time. But all of that is really just an excuse to do the video gamey stuff that other strategy games of the era lacked. The territory management and conquest feel like the busy work you have to do in order to get to the good stuff, though precisely how good it is in this particular cartridge is a matter of some debate. I come down on the side of not very. The good stuff, such as it is, gives you a chance to do medieval things in a series of little mini-events. It's like if Epyx's Winter Games series took place during the Norman Conquest. Instead of competing against France in ski jumps, you're going up against them in jousts. At various times, you can call for a tournament, invade other castles, or fend off invaders from your own castle. Each of these events plays out through a simplistic arcade-style interface, simplistic being the operating word for this game, in which victory helps speed you along to your goals of conquest, and failure does not. Tournaments consist of jousting in a one-on-one battle with flails. Castle invasions take the form of a succession of sword duels, like karateka but with epées. And to defend your own castle, you need to use bows and arrows to take out enemies who climb over the parapets of your walls before you're overwhelmed. None of these events are necessarily good, but there is something to be said for the fact that Defender of the Crown combines them all into a single package. You can also do some bonus things on the side, like summon Robin of Locksley, Robin Hood, to give you an assist, and to rescue and marry a kidnapped damsel, as was the way of 8-bit era video games. But really, the original point of Defender of the Crown wasn't to deliver a deep simulation experience or compelling arcade action. The game ultimately existed as eye candy. Defender of the Crown made its original debut in 1986 for the Commodore Amiga home computer, a PC that pushed the limitations of what consumer-level devices could achieve in terms of graphics. The Amiga featured the same Motorola 68000 processor used by the Atari ST and Macintosh, and which would later show up in the Sharp X68000 and Sega Genesis, and which, it should be noted, would help power Sega's superscalar cabinets. Like Sega's bespoke arcade machines, the Amiga supplemented its core CPU with some ass-kicking GPU components that put it in a class of its own. Defender of the Crown came into the world courtesy of a company called Cinemaware, which existed specifically to make games that did cool things with the Amiga's graphical capabilities. And they did! Leading off with Defender of the Crown, Cinemaware's games raised the bar for video game graphics with their exquisite detail, fluid animation, and incredible color depth. They didn't do much to advance the state-of-the-art in terms of actual gameplay. Again, most of their releases consisted of minigame collections linked by some sort of narrative element, but damn did they look good. In fact, Defender of the Crown actually drew some attention in Japan. Sony's GameTech Video VHS magazine devoted an entire segment to showing off the incredible-looking computer games happening in the West, primarily using Defender of the Crown as their showcase. But I think you can see the problem lurking beneath the surface here. Defender of the Crown didn't have the most compelling gameplay loop, but its exploitation of the Amiga's visual capabilities more than made up for that shortcoming. But the NES here does not have Amiga-level graphical capabilities, to say the least. As you can see, the NES port of Defender of the Crown fails spectacularly to recreate the Amiga game's visual appeal, which only serves to highlight the lackluster gameplay and shallow design. It's not the worst thing we've ever seen on NES, and honestly, Defender of the Crown has a place for players who find the likes of Nobunaga's Ambition intriguing, but need some training wheels before they feel comfortable picking one of 50 warlords who will need to allocate rice and set tax rates each season. But this version certainly does not hold up to the ravages of time. Unlike Super Sprint, where the visual simplicity was integral to the play experience, Defender of the Crown looks as ugly as its gameplay is clumsy. It's an interesting effort by Ultra Games to cater to Western tastes, but ultimately Defender of the Crown just serves to reinforce the fact that monarchy has no place in the modern world. What did Nintendo Power say? Well, nothing about Super Sprint, because Mommy and Daddy aren't speaking anymore. And really, barely any more about Defender of the Crown. It's almost like Nintendo doesn't care about strategy games and RPGs. Next time on NES Works, things are about to change. Actually, I'm not sure why I wrote that.